reserved to the states respectively or to the people. Now, those powers are enumerated in 18 points in Article 1, Section 8, including the power to lay and collect taxes, borrow money, establish post offices, declare war, and to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. It's that last item, number 18, the necessary and proper clause, which has been historically used to justify the ever-expanding scope of congressional legislation. Alexander Hamilton famously invoked it to justify chartering a national bank. The word bank appears nowhere in the list, but since coin money and borrow money are there, Hamilton argued successfully that a national bank would be necessary and proper for carrying into execution those powers. Number 3, the point to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes was given a broadly expansive reading during the New Deal. The court holding in United States versus Waynwood Dairy, the commerce power is not confined in its execution to the regulation of commerce among states. It extends to those activities which so affect interstate commerce or to the exertion of the power of Congress over it as to make regulation of them appropriate as a means to achieve a legitimate end. Does your dairy sell milk and eggs? Are milk and eggs traded in interstate commerce? If a customer buys local milk and eggs, does that diminish the need for interstate commerce? Thus we get the Agricultural Adjustment Act. Of course, these expanded government powers don't just happen at random. That particular expansion of federal power was fueled by a slight hiccup known as the Great Depression. But though the crisis passes, the expanded powers always seem to remain. Do you conduct commerce over the internet? Are interstate products advertised on television? Do cell phone signals cross state lines? Thus, we obtain the Federal Communications Commission, despite the fact that the Constitution gives the federal government no power to regulate any form of communication. None. Yet, the federal government currently mandates that telecommunication providers implement a covert wiretapping facility to be used to the government's discretion. Now, if the Commerce Clause can be used to require telephone companies to provide wiretapping capability to the police, can it require computer manufacturers to provide built-in surveillance capabilities on PCs?
Let's stop right there. Are such capabilities mandated in smartphones?
Surveillance capabilities?
Yeah.
I'd say they're the telecommunication network. Verizon is mandated to provide the surveillance capabilities.
Android.
The phone itself is not, but I would certainly think that a phone manufacturer, if you started manufacturing phones that could circumvent the surveillance capabilities, I could see, Congress moving to prevent that.
Okay, thanks.
So without constitutional provisions for these expanded powers and rights, who defines their limits? Nor is there any explicit constitutional power to regulate factories, the EPA, nuclear power reactors, the NRC, agriculture, an entire government department, recreational or pharmaceutical drug use, the DEA, and so on. Nuclear power. Now surely we need that to be regulated. What about 3 Mile Island? Chernobyl, Fukushima Daiichi. There may be great wisdom in government regulation of nuclear power, but there is nothing about it in the Constitution, and therein lies the rub. Politicians of both parties have found it more convenient to simply ignore the document, bolstered by lofty principles such as privacy and liberty, or serious problems such as pollution and drug abuse, rather than slog through the arduous process of amending it, and have increasingly preferred government according to popular wisdom, rather than government restrained by constitutional law. It is now quite common to read references to the long-standing, well-established constitutional right to privacy, usually in regard to abortion, despite the absence of the word privacy or abortion anywhere in the document. The constitutional right to privacy well predates Roe v. Wade. In 1923, the Supreme Court struck down a Nebraska law prohibiting the teaching of foreign language until 9th grade. And a few years later, struck down an Oregon law mandating that all children attend public schools. The reason went like this: liberty denotes not merely freedom from bodily restraint, but also the right of the individual to contract, to engage in any of the common occupations of life, to acquire useful knowledge, to marry, establish home, bring up children, to worship God according to the dictates of their own conscience. Many states in the first half of the 20th century tried to regulate or outright ban the use of contraceptives. For the Warren Court, it was too much. In Griswold versus Connecticut, the court used an expansive reading of liberty, the Fourth Amendment phrase, "Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property," to strike down Connecticut's ban on contraceptives, and a few years later extended this privacy right to include abortion. Those who eagerly wait eroded privacy rights to ban abortion might pause to remember that states have tried to ban private religious schools in the past, and that those same privacy rights have been used to guarantee parents the right to a Christian education for their children, even though neither abortion nor education are explicitly mentioned in the Constitution. Consider immigration. Do you know that the U.S. Constitution gives the federal government no power to regulate immigration? Article 1, Section 8 gives the Congress the power to regulate naturalization, but not immigration. For the first 100 years of America's existence as a nation, immigration was a state-level function. Only after the Civil War did Congress pass the first federal immigration acts. It wasn't until 1876 that the Supreme Court held that immigration was a federal power. Nor is this situation as outlandish as it might seem. The United States, prior to the Civil War, handled immigration much like the European Union handled it prior to the Schengen Agreement. I'm old enough to remember traveling in Europe pre-Schengen. You had to show your passport every time you crossed the national border. Italy, Germany, France all set their own immigration policies, and there wasn't enough illegal immigration to require any walls. Well, the communist countries needed a wall, of course, but the Western European states maintained separate immigration policies with no walls. So if we were to return to a strict interpretation of the Constitution, it would end the sanctuary cities debate. California would have the power to set its own immigration policy. This has progressed to the point where we now have a federal work permit in all but name in the form of the Social Security card. I was required to show my Social Security card the last time I got a job. Did you? Let's see. The Commerce Clause regulates commerce with foreign nations, which includes immigration of foreign nationals who can be denied the right to work. And since you can't tell who is and is not an immigrant, there would be no point in requiring work permits only from immigrants, so it's necessary and proper to issue work permits to American citizens and require us to present them any time we accept an offer of employment. See what a good lawyer I would have been?
Oh, you'd be awesome. Fantastic.
But these kinds of considerations fuel my cynicism of American politics. Of the people advocating for limited federal government and strict constitutional rule, I wonder how many of them would support returning immigration power to the states, abolishing ICE, no more work permits. I rather suspect that people advocate for limited government when they want freedom for themselves, but they're all for expansive government when it is to be applied to others. The most famous modern critic of those expanded extra-constitutional rights was the late Robert Bork, who equated the process to that of jury nullification and advocating instead a strict interpretation of the law as written. His comparison to jury nullification seems especially apt. If the Supreme Court can read the word liberty to include contraceptive drug use and foreign language education, why should an attorney not be allowed to argue to a jury that liberty includes recreational drug use? The most dramatic failure of the Constitution was the absence of any provision for states to leave the federal union or any prohibition of secession. Brexit will occur in a fairly organized manner thanks to Article 50 of the Treaty on the European Union, which provides for the withdrawal of EU member states. No civil war is required to leave the European Union. Nor was there any impetus post-war to amend the Constitution to correct this ambiguity. The war had been fought, after all, on the premise that there was no ambiguity. It's hard to imagine that any war would have been fought had the Constitution had included anything comparable to Article 50 in the EU Treaty. Any member state may decide to withdraw from the Union in accordance with its own constitutional requirements. Now, many people argue that the Reserved Powers Clause in the 10th Amendment reserved to the states the right of withdrawal from the Union, and I agree. Not only that, but many of the votes to ratify the Constitution were quite close. 187 to 168 in Massachusetts, 57 to 47 in New Hampshire, 89 to 79 in Virginia. It's hard to imagine that the Constitution could have been ratified at all if it had included an explicit prohibition on secession. The Union cause was illegal but just. The Confederate cause was legal but unjust, and therein lies the rub. The Confederate states claimed the freedom to leave the Union, but for what purpose? To enslave 4 million of their own people, ostensibly because of the color of their skin, but more realistically because they wanted to sit on their verandas and sip lemonade while the slaves picked cotton in the hot sun. Limited government is not the panacea that conservatives make it out to be. Freedom is not an absolute good. It has to be consciously used for good and can just as easily be used for evil. Every murder, every rape, every theft was empowered by the freedom of the criminal. Those who advocate for limited government often lose sight of a fundamental truth. Limited government only works in a society that is basically righteous. A society dominated by greed and oppression, on the other hand, will produce an unending string of abuses that will be countered by an unending series of calls for more government solutions. Limited government then just lets wicked people get away with evil. Perhaps it was foolish to think that a piece of parchment in the National Archives could ever restrain the power of government, or to think that limited government could ever endure in a society committed to institutions like slavery and segregation. We see something similar happening with capitalism today. One group in our society glorifies greed and demands limited government so they can keep lining their own pockets, while their opponents keep trying to expand the scope of government in order to restrain them. So we will not be getting any Supreme Court nominees from Democratic or Republican administrations who are committed to interpreting the Constitution as written. Instead, we'll get popular government, but not constitutional government. We'll get justices that rule based on their own conceptions of what proper government should be, rather than the text of the U.S. Constitution. The president will nominate justices whose conception of government meshes with his own, and the two dominant political parties will battle over the nominees in the Senate, each trying to shift the ideological balance of the court in their own favor. Shifting it back to strict constitutional rule is a motion that will not be entertained. Thank you.
Great job. Great job. Little comment afterwards?
Go ahead.
Yeah, now, let's figure out what the